the picture that's overall being painted here, which I think men can hear, is the godly life takes work. Don't
Yeah.
just sit and passively consume, right? Don't I go into church and I listen to the sermon and I take communion, then I go home. It's like, no, no, no. Like you're supposed to be active. You're supposed to be wrestling with God, right? You're
Yes.
supposed to be wrestling with doctrine. You're supposed to be wrestling with thorny moral or historical questions. And that's a joy. Like, and you don't really lose when you do that. You
Right.
know what I mean? You may have something that is occupying your mind, but by working through it, you have an answer that's purely, in a sense, your own. You get that piece of it, and not to simply be passive consumers. And I think I see what I think is a lot of passive consumer Christians, right, that
Yeah.
have been cultivated to be that way, rather than active, we'll say, combatants, both with culture and with doctrine.
Yes. And I think, going back to this holiness idea, you look at the temple, and you had like instruments in the temple, and one of
Mm-hmm.
that might be, for example, knives or forks or something that are used in the process of the sacrifices. If it's not being used, it's not holy, right? To be holy, it has to be used for the purpose it's set apart for.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's used for something else, it's not holy, right? So holiness is not sitting around like a lump on a log, just going, I'm not going to do any evil, right? We have to not only put off evil, but we put on what is good.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be devoted to good work of glorifying God. The good life is not just a life of avoiding evil and then being idle. Idleness itself is evil.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We need to be devoted to good work. And and we all know there's a real problem with boredom. If you don't do anything, like it's boring. Work is glorious. One of the great things about work is that it's interesting. And, that's why all the things we do that are not work that we're trying to fill our time with are pretend work, right? Like, if we're, when you play with kids, they're pretending to work. They're fighting dragons. They're building things. They're rescuing people. They're whatever. And they're pretending to accomplish work. And so, when you engage in good works, you're doing something useful and it's interesting. And the
Mm-hmm.
world is interesting, and creation is interesting, and God's plan is interesting, and God is interesting. So exploring these things, trying to study, trying to understand, communicating to other people, teaching to other people, organizing people to do work, all that stuff is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
It's glorious. It results in good things. It yields fruit. And so I think that people think this is boring and awful or whatever. It's glorious. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's so much more interesting than when I, used to waste time spending lots of time playing video games or whatever, right? Like it's so much more awesome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's make this practical then, because a couple of the things that I've learned from you regard Sabbatarianism and tithing, and how the way that people think about those things is like things we have to do, but instead thinking about them in terms of things we get to do.
Yes. So I believe, in the fourth commandment, where you're given 6 days to work. And so you're doing the ordinary dominion work during that time. There's all sorts of awesome stuff to do. And then the Sabbath is a day that's supposed to be a feast day of the word, right? Where you go, everybody gets to live as though they were a wealthy man who could be a scholar, right? You go, I'm so luxuriant in my condition in life that I can put off work and I can go study. There's a song, If I Were a Rich Man,
Mm-hmm.
from, what's the movie
Fiddle on the
called?
Roof.
Fiddler on the Roof, right? And,
Yeah.
he says, and the best part is I'd spend 7 hours every day, discussing the holy book. And it's like that idea, like people used to think of like, if I were rich, I could go and really devote myself to studying great culture and blah, 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 blah. Now we're like, if I were really rich, I could just hang out and drink Mountain Dew and play video games all day.
Oh, man.
And it's like, no, you would get bored from that, and you'd want to be able to get something more meaty. So the Lord's Day is a feast day for the soul, where you get to go and consume the bread of life in just huge proportions,
Mm-hmm.
where you get to go and study the Word of God, and you get to talk about it with other people. And so studying together, talking together, having this shared preaching, having this kind of day that's devoted to this life of people who are together studying and seeking to apply these things. It's this, everybody gets to be like the rich man who doesn't have to work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the Sabbath is. It's a day of freedom. It's a day of liberty to be able to glorify God in a deep way. So you have this day devoted to the worship of God. And every day is a day for working in one way. But there's a holy work. We rest from our ordinary work and recreation so that we can be devoted to the worship of God. And so your goal is to figure that out. And everybody goes, all the exceptions of like, well, what if somebody's injured? Can I help them? And all this other stuff. And you go, well, Jesus addressed all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And the point is, yeah, you do all the necessary work. You feed yourself, you get cleaned up for the day. You do all the ordinary necessary things to go about the day. And you do work of mercy to help people, to relieve them from present afflictions so that they can enjoy the Sabbath better too. But you're thinking of those things as things that are interrupting the feast. You don't say, well, I'm not going to do that because I'm feasting. You go, no, I have to do this. I need to do this. I need to do the work of necessity. I need to do the work of mercy. And this is good. And these are good things. And I'm glad I get to do these things. But I want to get back to the feast. I want to get back to worshiping God. I want to get back to these elements of worship so that I can make my soul fat with the good things that the Lord has revealed to us, right? And that's sort of this idea. And so that's the Sabbath. And as a result, it makes you have to count the time. Because when you remember the Sabbath, you become a project manager. When you don't have a Sabbath, you just kind of like one day bleeds into the other. You can use any day you like the way you want. Maybe work becomes the thing. You're like, oh no, I need the weekend to go chase down recreation. But once you have the Sabbath, you go like, okay, I have 6 days till the next Sabbath. What can I get done in there? And so you become this project manager. You're accounting for the time. And you're going, there's this drum beat of the Sabbath. And I would also say, you talked about reading the Word daily. You have morning and evening worship. And I would say, if you worship God in private, and if you've got a family, you're leading your family in worship too. So you've got the private worship and the family worship as drum beats for the day. And then the Sabbath is this big bass note that's helping you to keep rhythm through time. And so I think that makes you a project manager, to think about the time, to number your days and remember your finitude. And so with tithing, it's sort of the same thing where you go, my resources aren't infinite. And you count it and you say, I'm supposed to give 1/10 of this to God, 1/10 of my increase to God. And so you give that to the church. You lay it at the feet of the officers, is the way it's talked about in Acts, or this idea of the temple, which is obviously a type pointing forward not only to Christ, but also to the church body. So you have this idea of the money going in. There's 3 purposes for the tithe money. It's to provide for officers. It's to provide for equipping the saints to do ministry. It's like a place to meet in, for example. And for mercy ministry, orphans, widows, those who are disabled, those who have temporary disaster that they need help. So that's the purpose of those money. So you devote that money for that purpose. And what it does is it makes it so the church is focused on its purposes, if its resources are devoted to that purpose. And it also makes it so that you go, I don't have an infinite amount of money in my hands, but the Lord does. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And so if I give this to him and recognize he owns everything, then now I know he has everything. And I'm going to rely upon him to provide. And it makes you count your money. Mm-hmm. And so he makes us an accountant, not a project manager only, but also now an accountant. And so, capitalism comes out of this idea of the managing of time and the managing of resources as well. And so there's all this dominion work that occurs there. But as you think about it, you go, okay, 90 cents out of every dollar I gain, I get to steward in a way that's distinct from that 10% I give to God. I give them the first fruits. I give them the first of it. And so then the rest of it now, I need to intelligently apply it. So you're forced to figure out your total resource set with tithing because you have to give 1/10. And then you know what the rest of it is. And that makes it so you're inherently going to be drawn to managing it more. Mm-hmm. And so there's this way in which it makes you grow up. It makes you have to think about work in a different way. So you go, my time, my money are limited, and I need to devote them to the things that matter. And it makes you stop wasting both. So the neat thing is that people go, oh, I don't want to give up my Sunday. I don't want to give up the Lord's Day. Well, first of all, you're not giving up, it's his. But secondly, it's going to make it so you stop wasting time nearly as much as you were. And you're going to start finding that you have more time, but you're also going to feel like, wow, the reality is there's so much that I should be doing that I'm failing to do, that you're going to also feel stretched. So it will stretch you. It will make you realize you have more time. It will make you use the time better. And you will find that the Sabbath becomes a delight to you. And there's a promise associated with the Sabbath. It says, if you keep the Sabbath, if you call it a delight, right, then you will ride the high places of the earth. There's a promise of power for it, dominion. And with the tithes, the promise is if you tithe, that your barns will overflow. So there's these promises of prosperity, these promises of power that come with keeping the Sabbath and tithing. And if those things, if the Lord tests you in this life and doesn't give you those in a way that you receive in this life, that's because he's going to bless you even more at the last judgment. If you do those things in faith for his glory, there's always going to be a reward at the last judgment. And generally, there's a reward in this life.
I can say specifically the keeping the Sabbath has made a huge difference. The idea that all that day, no work, delight in the word. Like take it easy, right? And so that, and to know that I won't send emails on that day. I don't reply to anything. I don't engage with social media. Like I'm off. And my clients have known that. The men in my men's group have known that. I'm off. No work that day, right? And how relaxing it is. Like when I experience the temptation, like, nope, not going to do that. Just sit and read, just going to sit in quiet, right? Before going to church. And that recharges me to a degree where it's like, oh, I can get back at it on Monday. And I feel that refresh and I feel that rhythm of the week. And it does force me to have to be more precise in my time because I don't have 7 days a week. I got 6 days. And if in that 6 days I want some specific leisure time, well, I got a budget for that too. It gives a whole structure to my week, which forces me to grow up, right? And not just in a sense of like grow up, quit being so mature, but like grow up and take on more responsibility. Yes. And this gets back to the failure to lead men, like pleasing the women versus leading the men. Because this would be a job that a husband or a father would be doing. And like there are rules that we now have to follow because we keep the Sabbath day holy. So we don't get to do these things on Sunday, which means we have to do our Saturdays different. Oh, we don't like that. Well, guess what? Like I'm the father of the house. So I get to say this. And then you start getting into submission and headship. And then it's like, oh, no wonder this stuff isn't happening, right? Because we want to keep our easy, immature kind of lives. And we all want that. All of us, right, can be boys in our own way and little girls in our own way. Like, so it's shared. And yet there is still that call to maturity that we need to aspire to.
Right. And one of the neat things is as you propagate these in a church. So like for me, you who teach, do not teach yourself, right? Like when you teach, like you learn it deeper. But the other thing is now you're accountable to other people who've heard you say it. Now you've got to be there. So if I'm tempted to not keep the Sabbath or whatever, like I've got a church of people I've taught that we need to do this thing. And so now I'm pushed to have that with external things. And then you teach, men teach their wives this, and the wives are like, well, you told me to do this thing and you're not doing the thing. And you go, I got to do the thing. And then you teach your kids, and your kids are like, out of the mouths of babes, right? You teach them these truths and they're just like, that right there, that's not okay. They become external consciences, and it's so amazing the way you kind of build out the culture, and it's self-reinforcing. And we want that, right? If you want to be a man of integrity, if you want to be a man who's wholly devoted to the glory of God, you want external things that are going to encourage you to righteousness rather than tempt you to wickedness. Mm-hmm. And so we pray for the Lord to lead us not into temptation, but to deliver us from evil. And that prayer, that petition has two elements there. Those petitions that we look at. Lead us not into temptation. We're saying, the Lord, help to remove the external temptations to evil. Mm-hmm. And we're asking for this idea of like, let's put things in good order. Let's make it so as opposed to like a billboard that's pornographic, we've got a billboard that's, honoring of marriage. How about that?
Christ is Lord.
Which one's going to? and then on the other side, you go, deliver us from evil. We're praying that the tempting of Satan, but also that the tempting of the flesh, the internal element, would be subdued, right? Mm-hmm. And so we want to be holy inwardly. And we want to also put the externals in order in such a way as to encourage it. So we want both. And so sometimes people will go, oh, that's just hypocrisy. That's not holiness or whatever. It's like, no, holiness is going to care about the internal and the external. Mm-hmm. Hypocrisy is only going to care about the external. Let's care about both.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that.